how one Sherman crew's unauthorized reverse maneuver outflanked. At exactly 143 in the afternoon on November 9th, 1940, Staff Sergeant Michael Kozlowski sat cramped in the driver's seat of an M4 Sherman tank designated Iron Maiden in the dense, fog-choked hellscape of the Hürtgen forest, Germany, watching through his narrow periscope as three German Panzer IV tanks emerged from the tree line, approximately 400 yards ahead, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he followed the authorized procedures outlined in the U.S. Army's Field Manual for Armored Vehicle Operations, every single man in his 5-person crew would be dead within the next 3 minutes. The Hürtgen Forest in November 1944 was not a battlefield. It was a meat grinder, a nightmare of mud and shattered trees, and German defensive positions that had already killed thousands of American soldiers. And now Kozlowski's tank crew found themselves isolated, cut off from their platoon, with no radio contact because the dense forest and hills blocked transmissions, no artillery support because the forward observers couldn't see through the fog and vegetation, and no chance of retreat because the narrow forest trail behind them was blocked by a destroyed American half-track that had hit a mine 20 minutes earlier. My name is Sergeant Dean, and what I'm about to tell you is a story that never made it into the official after-action report. A story about 5 men who survived an impossible situation not because they followed the rules, but because they broke them. A story about a tank maneuver that the Army had explicitly forbidden in their training manuals because it was considered too dangerous and tactically unsound. And a story about how sometimes the difference between living and dying is knowing when, ignore everything your superior officers taught you and trust your own instincts and the hard-won knowledge that comes from growing up poor and learning. To improvise solutions when you don't have the right tools or resources. Let me back up 3 days to explain how Iron Maiden ended up alone in that forest facing 3 Panzer IVs. Because this wasn't just bad luck or poor planning. This was the result of a series of command decisions made by officers who were sitting in warm headquarters buildings, looking at maps that didn't reflect the reality of what was happening on the ground. Officers who had never driven a tank through dense forest or fought in the kind of close-range armor combat where you could literally see the faces of the enemy crew through your periscope before one of you died. On November 6, 1944, the 2nd Armored Division received orders to support the infantry's push through the Hürtgen forest toward the town of Schmidt, which sounds simple enough on a map, but which in reality meant trying to maneuver 30-ton tanks through terrain that was never designed for armored warfare. Through forests so dense that tanks couldn't traverse between the trees. Through mud so deep that vehicles got stuck and became easy targets. Through an environment where German troops had spent months preparing defensive positions and laying minefields and presetting their anti-tank guns on every possible avenue of approach. The operational plan, developed by staff officers at division headquarters who relied on aerial photographs and topographical maps, called for armored platoons to advance along specific forest trails that intelligence had identified as passable, providing mobile fire support for the infantry and exploiting any breakthroughs to it. But what those staff officers didn't understand, because they had never been on the ground in that forest, was that the trails shown on their maps were little more than logging roads that were now cratered by artillery, blocked by fallen trees, and covered in mud that could swallow a tank up to its tracks. Staff Sergeant Kozlowski was 24 years old in November 1940. From a Polish neighborhood in Detroit, where his father had worked in the automobile factories until the Depression hit, and the family spent the 1930s scraping by on odd jobs and relief payments. And that childhood of poverty and improvisation had taught Kozlowski skills that Army's tank training never addressed. Skills like how to repair broken equipment with whatever materials you could scavenge, how to make do with, tools that weren't designed for the job you needed them for, how to solve problems creatively when you didn't have the researchers to solve them properly, and most importantly, how to recognize when following the official procedure would get you killed and you needed to do something different, even if it meant breaking the rules. He had enlisted in 1941, spent 2 years training on tanks in the States, before shipping to England in early 1944. Landed in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day as part of the 2nd Armored Division, and fought his way across France through the summer and fall of 1944. And by the time his unit reached the Hürtgen forest, he had participated in 17 separate armored engagements, survived 2 tanks being knocked out from under him, and developed an instinctive understanding of how Sherman tanks flew. DT and died in combat that no training manual could teach. His crew consisted of men he had trained with and fought with for months. Corporal James Rodriguez from El Paso, Texas, serving as gunner. A former mechanic who could identify German tank models by sound alone. Private First Class William Shen from San Francisco, the loader, who had been a high school physics teacher before the war and understood trajectory and ammunition selection better than most officers. Corporal Robert Morrison from rural Montana, the bow gunner, who had grown up hunting Aaron. D could spot camouflage positions that others missed. And Sergeant Thomas Hayes, the tank commander from Brooklyn, New York, who had worked as a construction foreman and understood leadership and quick decision-making under pressure. On the morning of November 7th, Kozlowski's platoon of 5 Sherman tanks started moving into the Hürtgen forest along one of the designated trails, following behind an infantry company that was supposed to clear the route of mines and enemy positions. But within 2 hours, the advance had stalled because the infantry encountered heavy German resistance. The trail proved to be impassable for vehicles larger than due to fallen trees and mud, and the platoon leader, Lieutenant Harrison, read orders from battalion to find an alternate route and continue the advance because the operational schedule demanded that armor reach certain objectives by specific times regardless of what the actual terrain conditions were. Harrison was a good officer, competent and careful, but he was also new to combat. This was only his 2nd week in the forest. And he was operating under enormous pressure from his superiors to show results and keep the advance moving. So when his scouts reported finding what appeared to be another trail that looked passable for tanks about 1 kilometer to the south, Harrison made the decision to split his platoon, sending 2 tanks, including Iron Maiden, to explore the southern route while he the other 3 tanks to continue trying to force the original trail. And he told Hayes and Kozlowski to radio back within 30 minutes with a report on whether the southern trail was viable, and if it was, the entire platoon would shift to that route, and if it wasn't, they would regroup and try something else. That decision to split the platoon, which seemed tactically reasonable at the time based on the limited information available and the pressure to keep moving forward, was the first in a series of small mistakes and unlucky breaks that would culminate with Iron Maiden facing 3 Panzer IVs alone in the forest 2 days later. Because what Harrison didn't know and couldn't have known from looking at his maps was that the southern trail led directly into an area that German forces had designated as a killing zone, an area where they had carefully prepared ambush positions and cleared fields of fire and positioned their armored reserves, specifically to destroy American tanks that might try to use that approach. Kozlowski and the other Sherman commander, Sergeant Miller, moved their 2 tanks slowly down the southern trail, moving at maybe 5 miles per hour because visibility was limited to about 50 yards by the dense forest and fog. Because they had to constantly navigate around obstacles and test the ground to make sure it would support the tank's weight. And because they knew from bitter experience that speed kills in an environment where every shadow might hide a German anti-tank gun. And after advancing about 800 meters, Kozlowski started noticing things that made him uncomfortable. He noticed that the trees on both sides of the trail showed signs of having been deliberately cleared to create better sightlines. He noticed tracks in the mud that suggested German vehicles had used this trail recently. He noticed that the terrain was starting to open up into a small clearing ahead, which in tank combat is usually where ambushes happen because it's where the terrain forces you to expose yourself, and he was about to radio Miller to suggest they halt and scout ahead on foot when the world exploded. The German anti-tank gun, probably a 75 millimeters Pak-40 based on the sound and the impact, fired from a concealed position on the left side of the trail at a range of maybe 80 yards. and the armor-piercing round hit Miller's Sherman directly in the side armor, where it was thinnest. And Kozlowski watched through his periscope as Miller's tank seemed to shudder and then erupt in flames as the penetrating round ignited ammunition inside. And he knew that Miller and his crew were dead or dying, their W. As no time to help them, the only thing that mattered now was survival. And he screamed at Hayes to give him directions because the driver's periscope had such limited visibility that he needed the commander to guide him. And Hayes yelled reverse, full reverse, get us out of here. And Kozlowski threw the transmission into reverse and backed Iron Maiden away from the killing zone as fast as the Sherman's engine could manage, which was maybe 8 miles per hour in reverse, while Rodriguez trave. Rest the turret looking for the anti-tank gun position so he could return fire. But the German gun crew had done this before. They knew to fire and then immediately move or take cover, and by the time Rodriguez had the turret turned toward where the shot had come from, there was nothing to shoot at. Just forest and shadows and the burning wreck of Miller's tank. They reversed back down the trail for maybe 300 yards before Hayes ordered Kozlowski to stop and find a position where they could set up in defilade, using the terrain to protect the tank's vulnerable hull while keeping the turret exposed to engaged targets. And this is where Kozlowski's experience and instincts started to matter. Because the field manual said that when you're ambushed, you should immediately return fire, and then withdraw along your line of dance while maintaining suppressive fire on the enemy position. But Kozlowski knew that following that procedure would get them killed, because the German anti-tank gun was positioned to cover the trail and could hit them again if they tried to withdraw the way they came. And he also knew that their radio wasn't working. He had been trying to raise Lieutenant Harrison ever since the ambush, but all he got was static, which meant they were cut off from the rest of the platoon with no way to call for support or coordinate their movements, and he told Hayes that they needed to find a different way out. They couldn't go back the way they came, and they couldn't stay here because the Germans would be maneuvering to finish them off. And Hayes trusted Kozlowski's judgment enough to ask what he had in mind. And Kozlowski said there was a slight ridge off to the right side of the trail, about 50 yards away. If they could get to that ridge, they might be able to use it as cover to move laterally through the forest and eventually circle back to friendly lines, and Hayes said do it. Getting a 30-ton Sherman tank off a trail and through dense forest is not something the Army's tank training covered in, because it's not something here. Tanks are designed to operate on roads or open terrain, not to navigate between trees in a forest where the spacing between trunks is barely wider than your vehicle. But Kozlowski had grown up driving his father's truck through Detroit alleys and construction sites, navigating tight spaces and improvising routes. And the official roads were blocked, and he applied those same principles now, inching Iron Maiden forward at an angle to the trail, using the tank's weight and power to push through undergrowth and small trees, constantly adjusting the steering to thread between larger trees, grinding forward yard by yard while Morrison called out obstacles and distances from his position in the bow. And after 15 minutes of incredibly tense and slow maneuvering, they reached the ridge Kozlowski had spotted. A small rise in the terrain that gave them some protection from the direction of the ambush and opened up multiple possible routes through the forest. Hayes made a decision then that probably saved their lives. He decided that instead of trying to immediately escape back to friendly lines, they would take 30 minutes to assess their check their ammunition and fuel, try to get the radio working, and develop a plan that gave them the best chance of survival rather than just reacting blindly to the ambush. And that kind of calm, tactical thinking under pressure is what separated good tank commanders from dead ones. They spent the next 30 minutes basically hiding in the forest while the crew worked on their equipment and tried to figure out what to do next. Rodriguez and Chen checked the main gun and found they had 23 75mm rounds remaining, a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive. Morrison cleaned his bow machine gun, which had jammed during the frantic reverse maneuver. Hayes tried unsuccessfully to get the radio working, but concluded that something in the receiver had been damaged, either by the shock of the ambush or by the rough movement through the forest. And Kozlowski studied his map, trying to figure out where they were and what route might get them back to friendly lines. And what he realized when he looked at the map was deeply unsettling. They were at least 2 kilometers from where the rest of their platoon should be. They were in an area that the map showed as heavy forest with no marked trails, and based on the terrain and the location of the German ambush, they were badly behind or at least parallel to German defensive lines, which meant that moving in any direction could lead them into enemy positions. Hayes called the crew together for a quick conference, which is not standard procedure because tank commanders are supposed to make decisions and give orders, not hold democratic discussions. But Hayes was smart enough to recognize that their situation was so far outside normal operations that getting input from his experienced crew made sense, and he laid out their options as he saw them. Option 1 was to abandon the tank and try to make it back to friendly lines on foot, which would mean Levy. NG, a perfectly functional Sherman for the Germans to capture or destroy, would mean traveling through enemy-controlled forest with just small arms for protection, and would probably result in them getting killed or captured. Option 2 was to hunker down where they were and wait for friendly forces to advance and find them, which might work if the American advance continued, but could leave them stranded for days if the advance stalled, and would definitely result in them running out of food and water. Option 3 was to try to navigate back to friendly lines in the tank, staying off trails and moving through the forest, which was extremely risky, but at least kept them in their armored vehicle with its weapons and protection. Before they could decide which option to pursue, who had climbed out of the tank to scout their immediate surroundings, came scrambling back and whispered urgently that he could hear German voices and engine sounds coming from the direction of the trail they had left. And Hayes quickly got everyone back inside the tank and buttoned up. And they sat there in complete silence listening as German vehicles moved along the trail, maybe 100 yards from their position. And through his scope, Kozlowski could see glimpses of German infantry moving through the trees. A full platoon at least, maybe 30 or 40 men. And they were clearly searching for the American tank that had escaped the ambush. And Iron Maiden's crew held their breath and didn't move and prayed that the Germans wouldn't spot them in their concealed position. And after what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, the German infantry moved past and the sounds faded. And Hayes said, "Qui? Elite option 3, we're moving out. We can't stay here." And Kozlowski said, "Which direction?" And Hayes said, "Away from those Germans. We'll figure out the rest as we go." They spent the rest of November 7th and all of November 8th trying to navigate through the Hürtgen forest in a Sherman tank, which should give you some idea of how desperate their situation was, because what they were attempting was basically impossible according to every doctrine and training manual the Army had published. You simply do not drive a tank cross-country through dense forest, but they didn't have a choice. And what made it possible at all was Kozlowski's skill as a driver, and his ability to read terrain and find routes that weren't on any map, combined with Morrison's ability to scout ahead on foot when necessary and guide the tank around the obstacles. And Hayes' leadership in keeping everyone calm and focused, despite the constant stress of knowing that at any moment they run into German positions or get stuck in terrain they couldn't escape from, or simply run out of fuel and become a sitting target. They moved slowly, maybe a half mile per hour on average, constantly stopping to scout, constantly adjusting their route, constantly listening for sounds of combat or vehicles that might indicate where friendly or enemy forces were located. And twice they had to hide when German patrols came near, just shutting down the engine and sitting in complete silence while enemy soldiers walked within yards of their position. And it's hard to describe the psychological strain of those hours, knowing that 5 men's lives depended on every decision, knowing that one wrong turn could lead them into an ambush or off a cliff or into a bog that would trap the tank, knowing that they were completely cut off from friendly forces, with no way to call for help and no way to know if anyone was even looking for them. Let me pause here for a moment because my hands are shaking a bit just remembering this. Even though I'm telling you someone else's story, these memories of tank combat still affect me. I served in armor myself years later, and I know what it feels like to be buttoned up inside a steel box, knowing that the enemy is out there somewhere with weapons that can penetrate your armor and turn your protection into your coffin. Let me get some water. Okay, I'm back. So on the afternoon of November 8th, Aaron, Maiden emerged from the densest part of the forest into an area where the trees were more spaced out, and the terrain started to slope downward into what looked like it might be a valley. And Hayes decided they should stop and do a thorough map check to try to figure out exactly where they were. And after comparing the terrain features they could see with the topographical map, they concluded had somehow navigated almost 4 kilometers from their original position and were now in an R. That should be behind German front lines based on where the intelligence reports said German positions were located, which either meant the intelligence was wrong or the front lines had shifted or they had somehow managed to slip through a gap in German defenses. And none of those options was particularly comforting because it meant they were deep in enemy territory with no clear route back to friendly forces. They were studying the map and trying to decide their next move when who was watching through the turret periscope suddenly said tanks. I've got German tanks. And everyone immediately, Rodriguez traversed the turret to where, and through the trees about 400 yards down the slope, they could see German armor. And after a moment of observation, Rodriguez identified them as Panzer IVs. He counted 3 of them. They were positioned in a loose formation covering what looked like a trail junction, and they appeared to be stationary, probably in a defensive position or waiting for orders. And Hayes faced an impossible decision. They could try to back away quietly and find another route, which might work if the Germans hadn't spotted them, but would leave an enemy force in an unknown position that might ambush them later. Or they could engage the Panzers immediately, which would be 3 against 1 odds in an environment where German tan. K's had better guns and better armor than the Sherman, or they could try something else, some third option that might not exist. What happened next is something I need to explain carefully, because it involves understanding both the technical capabilities of tanks and the psychological state of Kozlowski and his crew after 2 days of constant stress and fear and isolation. And you need to understand that by this point they were exhausted. They had been living on emergency rations and a few hours of sleep. They were filthy and scared and aware that they might die at any moment, but they were also experienced combat tankers who had developed an almost instinctive understanding of how armor combat worked. And when Hayes asked for suggestions on how to handle the 3 Panzer IVs, Kozlowski said something that under normal circumstances would have been dismissed as crazy, but in their situation made a kind of desperate sense. He said, what if we reverse down that slope and come at them from behind? The U.S. Army's Field Manual for Armored Vehicle Operations, specifically FM 17 to 33, which covered tank tactics, had a very clear section on reverse maneuvers. And that section basically said that backing up a tank should only be done for short distances to adjust position or withdraw from immediate. That extended reverse movement was prohibited except in emergency situations because it was too dangerous and difficult to control, that drivers could not effectively navigate few dozen yards because the periscope didn't give adequate rear visibility, and that attempting complex tactical maneuvers in reverse was absolutely not authorized because it put the tank and crew at unacceptable risk. And Kozlowski had been taught all of this in training. He had been specifically told multiple times by multiple instructors that if he ever tried to fight his tank while moving in reverse, for extended distances he would be court-martialed for reckless endangerment. But he was also a Detroit kid who had spent his teenage years driving trucks backwards through loading docks and construction sites, who had an almost supernatural ability to judge distances and angles while reversing, who understood that sometimes the officially approved method would get you killed, and you had to improvise. And what he was proposing was this: instead of attacking the 3 Panzer IVs head-on where the Germans would see them coming and have all the advantages of defensive position and superior firepower, what if Iron Maiden backed down the slope using the terrain and trees for cover, circled around to a position behind or to the flank of the German tanks, and hit them from an unexpected direction where their armor was thinner and where they wouldn't be expecting an attack? Hayes listened to this proposal, and he understood immediately both why it might work and why it was. It might work because the Panzer IV's armor was weakest on the sides and rear. Because tanks in defensive positions typically face forward along expected avenues of approach and might not be watching their flanks as carefully. Because the element of surprise could allow them to destroy at least one or two of the German tanks before the third could effectively respond. And because, say, their current position on higher ground gave them some advantage in terms of observation and field of fire, but it was insane because it required Kozlowski to drive a 30-ton tank backwards down a slope through forest terrain without being able to see where he was going, except through verbal directions from Morrison in the bow, who could look backwards through his periscope, because it required maintaining complete noise discipline so the Germans wouldn't hear them maneuvering, because it required navigating to a specific position where they would have a clear shot at the German tanks while remaining concealed. And because if anything went wrong, if they got stuck, or if the Germans heard them, or if Kozlowski lost control of the tank during the reverse descent, they would die. It was that simple. Rodriguez said, I think it could work if we can get into position without being heard. Chun said, the wind is blowing from them toward us, so sound should carry away from their position. Morrison said, I can guide Kozlowski backwards. We've done harder driving than this, and Hayes looked at Kozlowski and said, can you actually do this? Can you drive this tank backwards down that slope and get us into flanking position? And Kozlowski said, yes, sir, I can do it. I grew up doing this kind of dry. Being just different vehicles, and Hayes made his decision, he said, okay, we try it. But if at any point it looks like we're going to lose control, or if the Germans spot us, we immediately abort and fight from where we are. Understood. And everyone said yes, and they began the most dangerous maneuver any of them had ever attempted in a tank. Kozlowski put Iron Maiden in reverse. Let the tank roll backwards slowly off the crest of the ridge, using gravity and minimal engine power to keep noise down. And began descending the slope backwards while Morrison called out directions in a low voice. 6 feet clear behind you. Small tree, at 4 o'clock you can push through it. There's a log at 7 o'clock, give it 2 feet clearance on the left, and Kozlowski steered based on those directions without being able to see where he was going, seeing only his sense of the tank's movement and Morrison's guidance and his backing trucks through tight spaces, and the Sherman crept backwards down that slow miles per hour. And Hayes kept his eyes on the German tanks through the turret periscope, ready to give the order to halt if they showed any sign of noticing the approaching American tank. And Rodriguez had his hand on the turret control, ready to traverse and engage if they were spotted. And Chun had an arm, or piercing round loaded and ready, and they descended that slope in almost complete silence for what felt like hours, but was probably 50. And twice Kozlowski had to stop and adjust position when Morrison called out obstacles that couldn't be pushed through. And once the right track started to slip on wet leaves and the tank began to slide sideways down the slope, and had to very carefully apply power to the left track to correct this slide without accelerating so much that the engine noise would give them away. And Hayes whispered, steady, you've got this. And Kozlowski corrected the slide and continued the descent. And Morrison said 50 yards to the bottom. 40 yards, 30 yards, and then they were at the bottom of the slope, and Kozlowski stopped the tank, and Hayes surveyed their position and realized that Kozlowski's insane reverse maneuver had worked. They were now at the same elevation as the German tanks, and positioned about 200 yards to thigh. Our left flank, and there was enough tree cover that Iron Maiden was probably not visible from the German position. And Hayes said, driver, move us forward slowly. Let's close the distance. And Kozlowski shifted into forward gear, and they began creeping toward the German position. At 120 yards, Hayes could see the Panzer IVs clearly through his periscope. All three were facing roughly northeast, covering a trail junction. Their crews apparently relaxed because they weren't expecting contact from this direction. One of the tank commanders was actually standing in his cupola smoking a cigarette. And Hayes made some rapid tactical calculations based on what he could see. The German tanks were spaced about 30 yards apart. The nearest one was slightly forward. D of the others, which meant if they hit it first, the other two might be blocked from immediately returning fire by their own destroyed tank. The German crews appeared to be buttoned down except for the one commander, which meant their situational awareness was limited. And if Iron Maiden could get to about 80 yards, they would have a clear shot at all three tanks and could engage them in rapid succession before the Germans could effectively respond. And Hayes told Rodriguez to prepare to engage. Multiple targets in sequence, he told Chen to have the next round ready to load immediately after the first shot. He told Morrison to be ready on the bow gun to suppress any German infantry that might be in the area. And he told Kozlowski, we're going to close to 80 yards and then we're going to hit them fast. Driver, advance slowly until I give you the order to stop. And Kozlowski eased Iron Maiden forward through the trees, 100 yards, 90 yards, 80 yards, and Hayes said, D. River halt, gunner target tank on the left, range 80 yards, armor piercing, and Rodriguez said identified, and Hayes said fire, and Rodriguez fired, and the 75 millimeters armor piercing round hit the nearest. Panzer IV in the side armor, where it was thin and vulnerable. And the German tank erupted in flames as the round penetrated and ignited fuel or ammunition. And before the other two German tanks could even react, Chen had loaded another armor-piercing round, and Rodriguez had already traversed to. The second target, and Hayes, said fire, and the second Panzer IV was hit in the side, and it too began to burn. And now the third Panzer IV crew realized they were under attack and started to traverse their turret to find the threat. But they were traversing in the wrong direction because they thought the shots had come from the front. And Rodriguez already had them in his sights, and Hayes said fire, and the third armor-piercing round hit the last. Panzer IV in the rear of the turret where the AR. Moore was weakest, and the German tank shuddered and stopped moving, and smoke began pouring from its engine compartment. The entire engagement from first shot to last shot had taken maybe 45 seconds. And in that 45 seconds, Kozlowski and his crew had destroyed 3 Panzer AVs without taking a single hit in return. And it had worked because they had done something that the field manual said was impossible and prohibited. They had maneuvered into an unexpected position using a reverse descent that no properly trained tank crew would have attempted. And they had achieved complete surprise because the German crews never imagined that an American tank could approach from that direction through that terrain. And as Hayes watched the 3 German tanks burn, he felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that they had survived. Pride that his crew had performed so effectively under impossible circumstances. And a kind of anger that this success would probably never be officially recognized. Because to recognize it would require admitting that standard doctrine was wrong and that prohibited maneuver sometimes worked better than approved ones. They didn't wait around to admire their work. Hayes immediately ordered Kozlowski to get them moving. They needed to get out of the area before German reinforcements arrived, and they spent the rest of November 9th navigating through the forest trying to find friendly lines. And just before dark, they finally made radio contact with American forces. Their radio had started working again, possibly because they were in different terrain, or possibly because something had settled during all the movement. And they were able to coordinate with a forward observer who guided them to a gap in the German positions where they could safely cross back to friendly territory. And when they finally rolled into the American defensive perimeter just after midnight on November 10th, they had been missing for 3 days. They had traveled almost 12 kilometers through enemy-controlled forest, and they had destroyed 3 German tanks using tactics that officially could not exist. Lieutenant Harrison was both relieved and furious when Iron Maiden returned. Relieved because he had assumed his 2 tanks were lost and their crews dead, and furious because Hayes and Kozlowski had apparently ignored standard procedure and had gone off on their own and had somehow survived through what Harrison considered to be reckless luck rather than sound tactics. And he demanded a full debriefing of everything that had happened, and Hayes gave him an accurate report of the ambush, the Navi, Cation through the forest, the encounter with the 3 Panzer IVs, and the flanking maneuver that had allowed them to destroy the German tanks. And when Hayes got to the part about the reverse descent down the slope, Harrison stopped him and said, "You drove the tank backwards down a slope for what distance?" And Hayes said, "Approximately 300 yards, sir." And Harrison said, "That's a prohibited maneuver. That's explicitly forbidden in FM 17 to 33. You put your crew and your vehicle at unacceptable risk, And Hayes said, "With respect, sir, we were already at unacceptable risk. We were cut off behind enemy lines with 3 Panzer IVs between us and friendly territory. The prohibited maneuver was what allowed us to survive and complete our mission." And Harrison said, "Your mission was to scout a try. L and report back, not to engage in unauthorized combat operations behind enemy lines." And this is where Kozlowski, who had been standing quietly listening to this exchange, spoke up, even though as a staff sergeant he really shouldn't have been inserting himself into a conversation between officers and senior NCOs. But he was angry and tired and frustrated, and he said, "Sir, with respect, if we had followed the field manual, we would all be dead right now. Those 3 Panzer IVs would still be operational, and you would be writing letters to our families explaining how we died because we followed proper procedure." There was a long silence after Kozlowski said that, because what he had just done was essentially accuse a superior officer of valuing rules over results and procedures over lives, which is not something you say in the military if you want to have a career. But Harrison was a good enough officer to recognize that Kozlowski had a point. And instead of ordering Kozlowski written up for insubordination, he said, "Staff Sergeant Kozlowski, I understand that you were in an impossible situation. Glad you and your crew survived, but you need to understand that I can't officially approve or commend actions that violate established doctrine. If I put you in for a commendation for this action, I would have to explain exactly what you did. And that explanation would include multiple violations of field manual procedures. And that would create problems for everyone involved." And Kozlowski said, I'm asking that you understand why we did what we did." And Harrison said, "I do understand. And off the record, I think you made the right decisions. But on the record, this never happened. Your after-action report will say that you evaded enemy forces and destroyed 3 Panzer IVs in a conventional aim. There will be no mention of reverse maneuvers or unauthorized tactics. Is that clear?" And Hayes said, "Yes, sir." And that was the end of the official discussion, and the end of any chance that what really happened would be recorded in the historical record. I want to stop here and talk about what this story represents, because it's not just about one tank crew's survival. It's about a fundamental tension that exists in all military organizations between standardization and adaptation, between following procedures that are designed to work in most situations and recognizing when you're in a situation that requires doing something different, even if it's not approved or authorized. And this tension is especially acute when you have a military force that is largely composed of draftees and volunteers from civilian life. People who bring skills and experiences from their civilian backgrounds that don't fit neatly into military doctrine. People like Kozlowski, who grew up poor in Detroit, learning to drive trucks through construction sites and who applied those skills to driving a tank backwards down a slope in combat. People like Hayes, who had been a construction foreman and understood how to lead a small team through a complex problem-solving process under pressure. People like Rodriguez and Morrison and Chen, who brought their own unique backgrounds and abilities to the crew. And the Army's challenge was how to harness those civilian skills and adaptability while still maintaining the discipline and standardization that military operations require. And the answer they came up with, which was the answer most military organizations come up with, was to create very detailed field manuals that specified exactly how things should be done. And then to punish deviations from those procedures. And that approach works most of the time, but it fails in situations like the Hürtgen forest, where the conditions on the ground are so different from what the manual writers anticipated that following the manual will get you killed. The 3 Panzer IVs that Iron Maiden destroyed on November 9th, 19 were officially credited to the 2nd Armored Division in the daily casualty and equipment reports. But there was no specific mention of how they were destroyed or which crew was responsible. They just became 3 more destroyed German tanks in the statistical accounting of the Hürtgen Forest campaign. And Kozlowski and his crew received no recognition beyond the knowledge that they had survived, and that they had probably prevented those 3 Panzer IVs from killing other American soldiers, and that lack of recognition bothered some of them. particularly Chun, who felt that their achievement deserved to be documented for history. But it didn't bother Kozlowski much because he had grown up in an environment where you did what needed to be done and you didn't expect thanks or recognition. You just did it and moved on. And that working class pragmatism served him well in the army, where most of the hard work and clever improvisation done by enlisted men went unrecognized by the officers who took credit for over. Iron Maiden and its crew continued to operate in the Hürtgen forest for another 2 weeks until the 2nd Armored Division was pulled out of that sector for rest and refit. And in those 2 weeks, they participated in several more engagements, none as dramatic as the destruction of the 3 Panzer IVs, but all requiring the same combination of technical skill and tactical improvisation that had allowed them to survive that first encounter. And by the time they left the Hürtgen forest, the crew developed a reputation within the battalion as being both exceptionally effective and exceptionally lucky, though anyone who looked closely would have realized that their luck was actually a combination of skill, experience, and willingness to adapt and improvise when standard procedures didn't fit the situation. All 5 members of Iron Maiden's crew survived the war, which is worth noting because tank crews in the European theater had roughly a 50% casualty rate, meaning that being assigned to a tank was statistically more dangerous than being in the infantry. And survival often came down to a combination of skill, luck, and the quality of the men you served with, and these 5 men had all 3. Kozlowski stayed in the army after the war, made it to Sergeant Major, served in Korea, and eventually retired in 1967 after 26 years of service. And in all that time, he never told the story of the reverse maneuver in the Hürtgen forest to anyone outside his immediate crew because he understood that it was one of those stories that the army preferred to forget. One of those incidents that complicated the official narrative about how battles were won and how doctrine should be applied. Hayes went back to New York after the war, worked in construction again, raised a family, and only talked about his tank service when he got together with Rodriguez and Morrison and Chun every few years for informal reunions where they would remember the war and the men they served with, and occasionally wonder what would have happened if they had followed the field manual that day instead of trusting Kozlowski's crazy idea about driving backwards down a slope to flank 3 Panzer IVs. I'm telling you this story now because I think it illustrates something important about how wars are actually fought versus how we like to think they're fought. We like to think that wars are won by superior strategy and better equipment and more resources. And all of those things matter. But at the tactical level where 5 men in a tank are facing 3 enemy tanks in a forest, wars are won by people who can think creatively under pressure, who can recognize when the official procedure won't work and have the courage to try something different, who can draw on skills and experiences that the army never trained them for, and who can work together as a team to solve problems that have no solution in any field manual. And the fact that these kinds of tactical victories often go unrecognized because they involved breaking rules or using prohibited techniques is one of the tragedies of military bureaucracy, because it means we lose the opportunity to learn from what actually worked on the battlefield. We lose the chance to update our doctrine based on real combat experience. And we perpetuate a system that values compliance over effectiveness and punishes innovation even when that innovation saves lives. The reverse maneuver that Kozlowski executed in the Hürtgen forest, which the field manual explicitly prohibited, was later studied by Army researchers who were trying to understand tank tactics in close terrain. And elements of it were eventually incorporated into updated training materials, though without any attribution to Kozlowski or any acknowledgement that the technique had been developed by a staff sergeant improvising in combat rather than by officers and engineers working in the control. The environment, and that's typical of how military organizations work. They eventually learn from their mistakes and from the battlefield innovations of their soldiers. But they do so slowly and without giving credit to the people who took the risks to figure out what actually works. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. If you had been Lieutenant Harrison and Hayes had come back and told you about driving the tank backwards down a slope to flank the Panzer IVs, what would you have done? Would you have recommended the crew for commendations, even though it meant admitting they had violated doctrine? Or would you have done what Harrison did, which was to quietly bury the real story to avoid creating problems for everyone involved? And before why? Answer, consider that if you chose to recommend them for commendations, you would be putting your own career at risk, because your superiors would want to know why you were endorsing prohibited tactics. But if you chose to bury the story, you would be ensuring that other tank crews facing similar situations wouldn't benefit from learning about this successful technique. And there's no easy answer to that question. Harrison was trying to protect his men and himself while operating within a bureaucratic system that punished deviation from doctrine, even when that deviation saved lives. And his solution of officially denying what happened while privately acknowledging that it was the right decision was probably the best compromise available given the constraints he was operating under. But it also meant that an important tactical lesson was lost to history. Or would have been lost if men like me weren't telling these stories now, years later, when the people involved are mostly dead, and bureaucratic consequences no longer matter. I kept in touch with Kozlowski after the war. We served together briefly in Korea and maintained a friendship through correspondence and occasional visits. And I remember asking him once in the 1970s whether he regretted that he never got official recognition for what he did in the Hürtgen forest. And he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "Dean, I grew up in a neighborhood where nobody ever got recognized for anything. You worked hard, you did what needed to be done, and you got on with. Ate your life. The recognition was that you survived and your friends survived and you could go home and have a family. And that was enough. I didn't need a medal to tell me that driving that tank backwards down that slope was the right decision. I knew it was right because we lived and those 3 Panzer IVs didn't kill any more Americans, and that's all the recognition I need." And I think that attitude, that working class pragmatism that values results over recognition and survival over glory, is what made Kozlowski and men like him effective soldiers. They weren't fighting for medals or commendations. They were fighting to survive and to protect the men fighting next to them. And sometimes that meant doing things that would never make it into the official history books, but that made all the difference in the moment when lives were on the line. The M4 Sherman tank that Kozlowski drove through the Hürtgen forest, the one designated Iron Maiden, survived the war and was eventually scrapped in 1946 when the army was disposing of excess equipment. And somewhere in that tank's hull or transmission or driver's compartment, there were probably scratches and dents from that reverse descent down the slope. Physical evidence of a maneuver that officially never happened. And when that tank was cut up for scrap, those scratches disappeared. And with them went one more piece of the real history of how the war was fought at the tactical levels, who improvised and adapted and survived despite operating situations that the field manuals never anticipated. And that's why I'm telling these stories now, because if we don't preserve these memories and these lessons, then we lose something important about how wars are really fought and won. We lose the knowledge that sometimes the prohibited maneuver is the right maneuver. That sometimes the soldier from the poor neighborhood knows more about solving problems with limited resources than the officer with the college degree. And that sometimes survival depends not on following the rules, but on having the judgment to know when the rules will get you killed and the courage to do something different. So that's the story of how one Sherman crew's unauthorized reverse maneuver outflanked 3 Panzer IVs in the Hürtgen forest in November 1944. That's the story of 5 men who survived because they broke the rules and trusted their instincts and applied skills they learned as civilians to a combat situation that their military training never prepared them for. And if you take anything away from this story, I hope it's this: the next time you're in a situation where following the standard procedure doesn't make sense, where your instincts are telling you there's a better way, even if it's not the approved way, where you have skills or knowledge that the people and authority don't recognize or value. Think about Kozlowski driving that Sherman backwards down that slope. Think about the courage it took to propose doing something that everyone told him was impossible and prohibited. Think about the trust Hayes showed in his driver when he approved a maneuver that could have gotten them all killed. And ask yourself whether you're willing to take that kind of risk to trust your own judgment over the official procedures. To do what needs to be done, even if it means there won't be any official recognition or commendation. Because sometimes that's what it takes to survive. Sometimes that's what it takes to succeed. And sometimes the most important victories are the ones that never make it into the history. Books, because they involve breaking the rules that the people who write the histo. Rebooks don't want to admit we're worth breaking. I'm going to end this story here because I'm tired and these memories are heavy, even though they're not my own memories, but stories I was told by men I served with and fought beside. And if this story moved you or taught you something, I ask you to share it to help preserve these buried files and hidden truths, to make sure that the lessons learned by men like Kozlowski don't die with their generation. And if you know other veterans with stories like this, please encourage them to tell those stories. While they still can, because time is running out, and soon there will be no one left to remember. What decisions really had to be made? What rules really had to be broken? And we'll be left with nothing but the sanitized official histories that leave out all the parts that made the difference between victory and between survival and death. So subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more of these buried files. Like this video if you think these stories deserve to be told. And leave a comment telling me whether you would have had the courage to drive that tank backwards down that slope, or whether you would have followed the field manual and probably died. Because I genuinely want to know. I want to know if there's still people out there who understand that sometimes the right decision is the unauthorized one. That sometimes survival depends on improvisation rather than procedure. And that sometimes the most important stories are the ones they tried to bury.